Hello and a very warm welcome. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. This brings us to the final, but to my mind, the most exciting and pivotal discussion we've had at Reuters Mobility this week. We've heard from DOTs, we've heard from cities, from transit agencies, we've heard from the OEMs, and a key part of the climate agenda keeps bringing us back to electrification. And a key question has often been, how do we make that more straightforward and more frictionless? So today's session is all around simplifying that process and easing the transition for public transportation. We're delighted to be joined by a trio of brilliant minds and leaders from Hitachi. We are led by Dean Bushy, who's the Vice President, Kyle Royal, Senior Director of Engineering, Senior Solution Engineering Director, I should say, apologies, Kyle, and Justin Hobson, who is the Solution Architect. So I'm going to let each of the panel introduce themselves shortly in a moment, and we're going to some more detail and some interactive elements through the conversation. I should also add at this juncture, there will be opportunity to put questions to the group, okay? Please use the Q&A function. It's easiest for us to track, and we will use those as we move through. We will also have opportunity to do some polling to get your views, to see where you are along your journey, and we can start talking that back to you live and quite interactive. So I've got a bit of context before we kick off. As funding and incentives increase for the electrification of public transport, the need for simplifying and easing the transition to electric buses and shuttles has become increasingly apparent. There are numerous considerations to factor into your plans: vehicle procurement, operational impacts such as route changes, charging and other infrastructure, just to name a few. So how can you be sure to plan and account for all impacts and afford a smooth transition to a full-scale EV for your ridership? So at that point, we'll start the conversation. Dean, a very warm welcome from Reuters. It'd be great for a few words on your role and what you're working on.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me. We're excited to be here, and I would agree with you. This is an exciting time. It can be kind of a daunting and nebulous conversation when you start talking about electrification of vehicles, electrification of the grid. But I think it's super exciting. You're going to hear some experts talk about several subjects today, some of my colleagues. I'm the Vice President of the Global Social Innovations business for Hitachi. Global Social Innovations business drives us to things that are good for the environment, good for society, and that drive business. So we get to work on really cool stuff. That's what that means. We get to work on things such as electrification of vehicles, distributed energy, alternative energy sources, digitization. It's just a wide swath of things that are good for driving benefit to the environment and to society. So we look at it from the Americas perspective, and I have a great group in my team, from Kyle and Justin and some of my BDs that are with me today. So Kyle.
Thanks, Dean. Luke. My name's Kyle Royal. I'm the Senior Solution Engineering Director. I lead a phenomenal team of unique individuals because when we look at electrification and the transformation, it's no longer just a digital or a business conversation. It's really both of them together. So we have individuals that specialize in really subject matter experts of the electrification process, but then we also have individuals that really understand and can go deep into what does that mean for your business, your operations, and other different components when you're going through this electrification. Justin Hobson is one of my key individuals. Justin?
Hey team, Justin Hobson out of beautiful Denver, Colorado. My background is in practical uses of quantitative methods. And in the last few years, I've really been focused on the electrification of fleets, and in particular, enabling the technology transformation underneath the new business models.
Super. Thank you, Justin, Kyle, and of course, Dean. Next, I'm going to share my screen, and we've got a couple of slides we're going to talk around. I'm going to put some questions to the group, and we'll kick the conversation off. So bear with me one moment as I start to share. Super. I'm going to jump straight into the second slide here, folks. So we've heard lots through this week around electrification as a goal, as an infrastructure project, as a vision, as something which is happening right here and now. We've also heard from respective folk across the US about some of the challenges they're seeing. But Hitachi, you're working closely with this leadership across all of the US and the Americas. And please tell us more the key challenges that you're seeing and sort of how you're addressing that. Dina, I guess I'll come to you first and let that then work through with the rest of the panel.
Yeah, thank you very much. Justin, I should say I'm from beautiful Asheville, North Carolina. So with that in mind, we always try to find out what the customer needs first. We always start with the customer in mind. In this case, the customer is kind of twofold. One is the customer is the passengers that transit the transits area. I mean, who's riding on your buses, who's riding in your system. The second customer is the transit authorities themselves. So from our perspective, we're looking at needs of both of those customers. What do they need? Well, they're kind of similar. One, they want to be safe. They want to be informed. They want it to be easy and convenient. And I think as we move forward, and I know as we've engaged with customers, they want to be more aware of the impact they're having on the environment. What does that mean to me? What is my carbon footprint? What are my alternatives to get around? I mean, yes, I want to be safe, but as we grow forward in the environmental awareness, the passengers will be more aware and driving that also. So part of this, the questions that we see, and you see them on the screen, they're highlighting questions that we've actually heard from customers, like, am I a good candidate? Should I do this now? We've heard so much change about technology changing so quickly. Maybe I should just wait. How much is it going to cost? Is it just buying the vehicles, or is it the infrastructure? Who's going to do the infrastructure? Is now a good time, or should I wait? And then if I get through all these questions and we've started to think about, and this is the starting point, by the way, ask questions. You need to be informed. So the best start is to not ignore it, but to start asking these questions is, how do I plan for it? One of the key questions that we always get beyond the technology side is, this is all great, but this is very expensive. Maybe I should just hang on to my buses that I have now, and we'll see how long they last. Well, that's a key question that we've addressed several times over. And I think, Kyle, you've got some perspectives on that from talking directly to some customers.
Absolutely, Dean. So America is going to go through an amazing transformation here through a lot of the infrastructure bills that are out there. Just taking a few quick notes, there will be $6.42 billion available just to reduce transportation congestion. There is $18.4 billion available for rail and bus in urban areas. And specifically, there's $2.3 billion available for low or zero emission vehicles, buses actually. And so a lot of money is coming. Amazing opportunity to take a hold and really look at this, this transformation. And, it's just, there's often a lot of times there's pressure from leadership, from states, from other sources saying, hey, we have a 2030, 2035 zero emission decarbonization effort. Are you going to be part of that? And so as Dean said, it's really, you start with the questions, and then you need to start to understand, hey, how and how much do I need for this transformation? And then ultimately make that plan to go out and capture some of that available money to help your organization make that transition. And Justin, what are some things as we make that transition we should think about as far as business and operations?
Yeah, Kyle, I recognize this is a journey. And actually, I think we've got a maturity curve. Luke, can you take us to the next slide?
Yeah, absolutely. And just a quick one to the audience here watching live. When a couple of questions come through, if you're seeing stuff on here which you want asked or want us to come to, please do. We will make time to come back. But Justin, yeah, next slide. Here we go.
Thank you. So if you take a look at this, you can see it's actually a continuum. And that's because fleet transitions, they take years. So a fleet is actually likely to be in each of these stages, starting with a good plan, and then working through that electrification and getting the infrastructure in. And that infrastructure is also going to scale. So you recognize you're going to be in each of these phases for a long time. And actually, it turns out that can be a very good thing, because it means you get time to ramp all the supporting operations. you get to understand how does our maintenance cost change, right? You recognize, okay, the promise is I should have to do fewer repairs. There are fewer moving parts, fewer wear surfaces, but those parts aren't as readily available. So the parts themselves may cost more until we get the scale that'll come with production and adoption. And so everybody wants to see, like, what's that really going to mean for my operations? And I think that actually works well if you understand it as being a journey and a series of incremental changes, not something that you have to accomplish all of it in 1 year. But I do think it starts with a good plan. And Kyle, you might want to talk a little bit more about that journey, or maybe Dean, you've got a perspective on that.
Yeah, I want to hit this slide real quick, Justin. I'm going to ask you, a lot of this is there. These are not distinct stages, are they? I mean, when we go, you can talk about optimizing your fleet right now. You can talk about getting your fleet connected for data. It's not you go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to the nirvana, which is autonomous. It's a continuum, correct?
It very much is. And as the data guy, I'm always interested in, what do we have for a fact base today? What are we collecting? What are the priorities of the community that we're serving? The economics are the most obvious one. And I think we're going to talk more about that. But the social equity concerns, each community is a little different in its geography, its demographics, its history. And so there's a lot of thought that already goes into transit planning, and we want to carry that forward. We want to continue to serve those different constituencies. And so that's why I look at electrification as it's just one more operational consideration in a much bigger set of operations.
Dean,
let's take a look at the customer journey. Go ahead, Kyle. I'm sorry.
No, I just had a thought here about it's just not a EV maturity for an entire fleet. There's actually subsets and use cases within your fleet that also goes through this EV maturity at different times. So that's something else to think about, that right now we're talking about buses and some other vehicles because they are on the market. And then eventually there will be other vehicles, larger vehicles, different types of vehicles that'll start to enter the market, and we'll go through this maturation process at a later date.
And it also applies to last mile delivery, utility trucks. It's not just passenger vehicles that go through some of this journey. Let's take a look at the passenger journey though, because we talked about always keeping the customer in mind. So if you go to the next slide, thank you. This is kind of a high level, really good words for us to use, but it guides us when we go engage with a customer, because where are you on this journey? You should look at that and say, this is the first honest assessment to say, all right, we've already got the money. We've already bought our first 2 or 3 EVs. We're ready to implement. You may not be starting at the first slide, but let's take it from left to right. Your first step is to say, they ask the questions. I mean, my mom always said, you can't get where you're going unless you know where you're starting. And I always add, yeah, but I'm going to enjoy the journey. That's part of this whole implementation journey. So let's assess where you are. Do you have sufficient vehicles? How many ICE vehicles do you have? What is their age? What is their current cost to operate versus what you may see for EVs? Then you have to make the business case, and Kyle's going to hit that in just a second. But you have to have a conversion roadmap, and that's where people like Justin and some of the other experts on my team can come to you and say, let's take an assessment of where you are. Let's get a roadmap and a game plan and figure out what's the cost, how are you going to get there? The next part I like to highlight is a city like Orlando, where they did a pilot, an EV pilot. They planned the pilot. They bought 1 EV bus. They said, let's just start with one. They 1 EV charger, 1 EV bus doing 1 route. And let's examine and let's exercise this whole new system. It's not really a new system, but it's just a new asset, as Justin was saying earlier, in the system. Then they expanded to 8 buses. Okay, well, now we have 8 buses. That changes things. It's a game changer a little bit, because now you got to have different charging requirements. 8 buses does not mean 8 level 3 chargers. No, it could mean a depot. And where are you going to charge it? Is it going to be with your ICE vehicles? And do you need infrastructure in the city? Do you need support and money from the city? Once you grow past that 8, they're ready now to expand to 150 buses. they've got a plan to go out there and say, all right, this worked. It can integrate great. So they're ready for the implementation plan where they need financing. They go through the procurement process and they need to figure out who's going to operate and maintain. And the last consideration that I would say, which is going back to Justin being the data guy, is to optimize, right? So you have all this data that's going to be coming off these EVs. You have this data from these fleets. You have this data from passenger movement. Now you can optimize charging time. You can optimize the grid. You can optimize the journey. It's super exciting. It can be daunting, but you need to assess where you are on this journey.
So Dean, just to jump in very quick, I don't know if you can see this now, but we've asked the group, and from the responses we have, we've got 57% are at the assessment stage, 14% are piloting, 22% are implementation, and 8% of the audience are at the optimized stage. So I don't know if that shapes your comments or from Justin and Carl as well as you continue talking through.
I think that's an honest, I'm going to use assessment, honest assessment from the customers or the people that are watching this, because most of us are in the assessment phase. It's the market penetration right now for EVs is less than 5%, depending on which vehicle you're talking about. It's going to grow rapidly. Most people would fall in that assessment phase. For the people that are in the pilot or implement phase, great, you're there. You're also going back to the assessment phase, right? You're always going to loop back, give feedback, and assess. But one of the key elements of this is how do I make the total cost of ownership argument? I mean, it's got to come back to money. It's got to make business case money. No sense. Kyle?
Absolutely. And I think that's awesome that there's so many people here in the assessment phase and that there's so much opportunity to really understand, plan for, and have a successful pilot implementation and rollout of a fleet. And so as Dean mentioned, it does start often with a total cost of ownership model. And that goes to saying, hey, how much is this going to cost me in the long run? And what are some things that I can plan for to maybe offset some of those costs? How much am I going to do capital versus OpEx? And there's some interesting things with electric vehicles that are coming out and that we'll talk about here in a minute. But the total cost of ownership is honestly just not a money study. It also needs to be a carbon study, because you're doing this transformation not just for a savings or not just for a new vehicle. You're doing it because there's a greater purpose, so there's a greater mission. And so we find that it's very helpful to say, hey, as I'm going through this transition, this is how much we're providing back to the larger vision of my municipality, of my corporation, of my state. I'm saying I'm going to help be part of this carbon neutral or lower carbon initiative. And so that's a very important thing that we believe should happen within the assessment phase. And going back to those use cases in different vehicles, that also really comes out in the fleet fit. There are a lot of EVs that are on the near horizon, but honestly, they're already booking out. So if you're booking an order for a bus, I believe you're looking at 2024, 2025 for some chassis. Super excited about Ford and their F-150 and some other vehicles that are coming out for just the everyday driver. And that's going to transform a lot of different fleets. But again, they're booking out. So how are you going to plan for that? And how are you going to incorporate that into your rollout plan? The other thing about the assessment phase is EV, you have infrastructure that you have to consider. And so you really need to have an understanding through that assessment phase of what infrastructure I need. Dean mentioned, am I just going to buy 8 plugs and 8 chargers? Am I going to do a depot? Where is it located? But more importantly, how much power do I have at that facility? Buses take a lot of power. And do you have that power available? Do you have to plan around different power peaks? And how is that going to influence your operations? Are you going to put power out on the route to maybe you've got very long routes in your rural area? How are you going to plan for that so that you can get that vehicle through the day? And so those are some of the things that you should also look at the assessment phase. Tying it back into some of the federal dollars that are coming out, this is an opportunity potentially to really start to look at grabbing money from different buckets to really do a holistic rollout. So you've got opportunity to fund your buses, you have opportunity to fund your infrastructure and really making an effective rollout. Finally, as you're looking into the future and saying, okay, how is an EV different than an ICE vehicle? It absolutely is. And the main part is obviously the battery. The battery most likely will need to be replaced at some point in time in this life. And so how can you manage that? How could you potentially turn that battery, instead of a sunk capital cost, into an operational cost? And we have some thoughts around that.
I'm going to throw two. One, let's hit the battery real quick, because you just said there is a environmental impact to produce batteries, and we understand that. So we're starting to look at not just the carbon emissions, but the total cost, environmental cost of putting an EV out there. It's not as simple as saying I'm no longer burning gas, therefore I should go to EVs. The other one that we've heard is I either have to be environmentally friendly or I have to make money. And I'm really getting, as we go through this analysis and we work with customers and we go through these pilots, it's not an either or. Yes, there are some trade-offs, and yes, there's going to be a significant impact on the maintenance facilities, the depots, the infrastructure. But I don't think it's going to be ultimately I want to save money, so I can't go to EVs. Justin, would you agree?
Yeah. For me, I really think about it. There's really two big levers that I look at. And I like to keep it simple. So I think about, on the CapEx side, it's about vehicles and infrastructure. Those are my two big ones. And on the OpEx side, it's really energy and drivers. And in that sense, it's the business that we've always run. But what's different now is and Kyle hit on it, is you've got to plan ahead, because you've got both the infrastructure timeline, and it's different. You can put in a fuel depot generally in a shorter time than you can get 5 to 10 megawatts put into a depot. We're looking at the different timelines are coming from the state mandates, and you realize it feels like I'm starting to be in a queue of people that are all going to have this need, and I wonder how that's going to affect my actual timeline. And the answer is, it depends a whole lot on where you live and how much spare capacity your utility has, how much hiring they've been able to do. And then on the vehicle side, you heard Kyle also talk about his excitement for the vehicles that are coming. Me too. I love at the conferences, you actually get to touch them, ride on them, feel them, get that experience. Or for the few municipalities that actually have rolled out the buses, and we saw this with the CNG adoption and some propane buses. Riders like it too. So there's an enthusiasm for that. When you look at the production plans, you realize, yeah, even if I wanted to convert everything in 3 years, I couldn't. I can't get the infrastructure, and I can't get the vehicles, which leads you to then, okay, I remember it's a journey, and I'm okay with that. It won't be nearly as disruptive either. On the OpEx side, I mentioned energy and drivers. What's new is that the relationship can be different with a battery electric vehicle. You think about, what's the price difference between a 20-minute charge versus a 45-minute charge? That's not something we've really had to think about historically. Well, all right, let's break it down. It depends on the time of day. It depends on the location. It depends on whether or not you've got a driver waiting in the vehicle, so I'm incurring those costs. Or is it, it's an overnight depot charge. I don't have any manpower or payments there. And what we look at in the biggest, again, back to the big lever, in general, the energy price is going to dominate. And that's, we talk about the difference between petroleum or, gas, diesel, and electricity. It's true that in the, if you look over the decade, gas prices fluctuate quite a lot relative to electricity. But if you look at within a day, particularly in geographies that have really high demand charges, you might have a 300% variation within the day. And so when and how you charge, and you mentioned, Dean, the battery electric or the BESS systems, the storage systems that allow you to shift when you do that charging, that also is something new we've got to factor in.
And I think, Justin, that actually helps answer one of the questions that's out there. You know, can the current US power grid support all of these new electric vehicles? It's a question mark. And I think to have the best chance to get there is to do things like that, where we're taking demand where there typically wasn't demand before, and making sure that we're smartly scheduling, organizing charging of vehicles.
But Carl, I want to just come back to you as well quickly. There was a question I saw from Xavier. I don't know if you can speak to that. When he's looking at total cost of ownership.
Yeah.
Xavier is asking, do customers include simulations about carbon taxes?
So that's definitely a much more advanced total cost of ownership than what we start with. You know, often it really is a apples to pears comparison of EVs to ICE vehicles. But yes, we have done and looked at very complex of, you know, what are the energy rates in the future? What's the make versus buy of energy comparisons, and then also just not the carbon taxes, but then the carbon credits that you could potentially produce. Because if you make so one of the things we haven't delved into, but there's an opportunity to share infrastructure here. So when you're looking at your TCO and you're creating a charger, is there an opportunity to actually get some carbon credits from charging in a sustainable way?
Or monetize that charging station when it's not being used.
Yep, and additionally monetize it. So particularly when we talk about municipalities, is there shared infrastructure opportunity? So the trash truck and the bus and other vehicles can all utilize the same depot. They're on different schedules hypothetically, and you could start to figure out how to optimize that.
No, very good. And I think it's been a great explanation. The process makes a lot of sense. I know looking at the poll, a lot of folk are at the assessment phase, but the folk moving through that, we talked execution, considering the balance between new vehicles, operational impacts, route changes, and of course, charging infrastructure. Maybe just you can talk a little bit more on the execution side.
Yeah. When I think about the execution, it's what are all the aspects you really want to impact? So I like to start at the beginning asking, well, how do you measure success today? Is it a mix of financial? Yes, everybody says yes to that. Is it environmental? Increasingly, we're hearing there are explicitly environmental goals for communities. And third is social outcomes. And increasingly, we're hearing about more and more diverse social outcomes and a better understanding of what social equity might look like in our communities. And so we said, okay, great. Let's take those three buckets then. Within that, what matters today? And realistically, where could we be in 5 years, 10 years? And it's pretty exciting to think about the change in 15, because that's, I think for many fleets, realistically, that's what it's going to take to turn over the entire fleet. And so you think about, okay, over that timeline, I can think back 15 years ago, where were we? How much change have we made? And with the technology, and Dean hit on it right off the top, there's a lot of money pouring in here. Don't miss out. Because this is perhaps a unique window to pick up that opportunity and make those investments in our communities. And that infrastructure, some of this is 40-year infrastructure. So it may outlive me. I'm excited by this opportunity.
No, very good. And Dean, any comments from yourself, just being about round?
Sure, if you want to go to the next slide. One thing I didn't hear, and I know Kyle's going to laugh a little bit because we've discussed how far does an EV have to go. There's a little bit of range anxiety too. So that goes back to that assessment phase where you figure out, what are my needs? How far do my buses drive? Do they always charge at the depot? And it is a real concern, maybe much less so on a fleet that operates locally. But a lot of the charging or the life cycle or how far it can go, the range is dependent on several things. What are the conditions? What's the temperature? How is the driver driving? Is he stopping pretty hard? But that's another part of the analysis. And we're going to talk about the low carbon transport on the left-hand side. These are some of the ones we've looked at recently with transit authorities. We've really looked at intelligent transportation infrastructure and multimodal systems. How really can you make it frictionless for the user? And that's kind of on the right side. It's a little bit outside of this discussion, but that's important. If they go from a train to a bus to maybe a Uber or a Lyft, how are they going to transit, and what is the ease at which they get there? Is it a single payer payment system? Can they get one ticket? Are they informed? That's part of making the customer happy. But if you look on the left-hand side, then you start talking about things to consider when you want to go with low carbon transport. Sounds really ominous, low carbon, but it really isn't. When you look at, I can optimize the route, I have more data, I can figure out what my needs are. Now I can start managing my assets better. So part of moving to electrification will necessarily provide you with more data and more opportunities to optimize. And then we talked about charger location. There's lots of things to consider. Who owns the charger? Who installs the charger? Who runs the charger? Who monetizes them? How does the city get access to them? How do the users get access to them? What size do you need? Where should they strategically be placed? And that's based on past performance. So you could do a data analyst study on, okay, these are the routes, and to get maximum use of this charger, it should be this size at this location. And then the last block that I'll hit is the integrated alternative energy solutions. A lot of people know that when you produce electricity, some of it's done by fossil fuels, right? So there are other ways to power the grid that's going to get you to electrification. And that should be considered also. Are you using solar power, wind power, hydropower to actually get the electricity, which is not just pure environmentally friendly, to the grid and to the vehicles? So this is kind of a complex picture, but we're talking about the two on the left. And again, it's really exciting. I'm glad I've got Justin and Kyle, because they live in this world as far as route optimization, asset management, moving the transition forward. I'll throw it to either one of you guys.
Yeah, so for me, I'm most excited when we talk about low carbon transport. We've been doing the route optimization work for a long time, right? Many of us can remember the gas crisis of the 70s. So this idea that I would like to consume less, it would have an economic benefit, it would have an environmental benefit, that's really a given. And I also recognize there are a lot of well-trained fleet managers, particularly when I work with cities and even small municipalities. They've been able to attract good talent. They've got a strong process. They've got a strong maintenance person. They understand it's my duty to get the most out of this asset and run that bus as long as it makes sense. What's new is this charger location optimization. It's like, well, that depends on my context. Am I a depot context? Obviously transit, you're not doing an at-home charge. But do I want to do some opportunity charging along route? Some of that is a new idea, particularly with some of these pantograph chargers you've started to see more recently. And when I lump it together with the bottom left there, the distributed energy management, I've been having a lot of fun talking to the different providers here, because we're being able to better integrate solar and wind, and now the battery energy storage systems and the software that allows you to switch back and forth and make those decisions about, hey, do I want to use this power right now, or do I want to store this power for later? And in some places, you can even think about, would I want to sell this back into the grid if I don't have all the demand for the amount of storage I have? That doesn't work everywhere. It's absolutely depends on your utility, the regulation, and where you operate. And as we see those come on, and we're already starting to see it, so that opens up a lot more of the right side of this, where I've had the pleasure of working with some of our rail customers on some of the multimodal integration, not just the digital side, the ticketing and all that, but to the extent we can have those hubs for trains, buses, and now you're seeing microtransit come into the picture, and the dynamic scheduling. It's like, yeah, maybe 5 years ago, we didn't really think about scooter availability for last mile. And that's been fun to bring that in and think about how do we meet a variety of needs that are using our public transit systems.
Super, thank you, Justin. Great explanation. We've got plenty of food for thought. I want to see Kyle. Do you have anything to add on the?
Yeah,
on
actually,
the
so
slide? Yeah,
yeah, there's been a few questions about hydrogen, and I think that's actually pretty pertinent to this slide, because yes, hydrogen will absolutely have a play in transportation at some point. I don't think a lot of people realize that there's not a lot of green hydrogen. Hydrogen right now is often made through byproducts of dirty processes. And so we see electrification coming first. It is here. I mean, I think that's the point. We have seen, and we are working with some organizations that are starting to do hydrogen transformation projects, but you're not going to have the readily availability of electricity. So, even though you might have to work with your utility to get a special line or more capacity in a certain area, it's a totally different ballgame than getting hydrogen to a specific area. And so we do believe, and we foresee, that there are use cases in certain types of vehicles that most likely will be predominantly hydrogen. So that's to be determined. But I think right now we know that electricity is here, it's available. We already have a very robust infrastructure. It needs to be tuned, or it needs to be managed and optimized. But that means that we can make a lot of this conversion today. So I think that's a great conversation, or questions in the question answer, just to tee that up.
Super. So Kyle, perhaps not quite on hydrogen yet, but when we're looking at electrification, are there any specific projects or examples that you've done, that you're working on, that can actually show everything that you've spoken to so far coming into play?
Yep. So I think we have the Optimized Prime project that is a phenomenal opportunity for Justin, is well versed in this.
Yeah, this is one of my favorites. I am glad to talk about this. So we're delighted to be part of this consortium of powerhouse companies. It's the world's biggest commercial electric vehicle project. And you can see it's UK Power Networks, Uber, Royal Mail, Centrica, Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks. And originally, we were doing the business modeling, and we estimate if we can put this into practice, and we're successful, and we roll this throughout Great Britain, what would it mean? You can see it's the 2.7 million tons of CO2 reduction by 2030. So I struggle with, okay, 1 million tons of carbon, turn that into something I recognize, because that's not a unit I deal in day to day. So it's similar to a Boeing 747. If you flew around the world, not once, not twice, but about 1,500 times. And over that same period, it's estimated that UK Power Networks operators and their customers are going to save over 200 million pounds. So this EV as a service proposition, building on Optimized Prime, it's really around sustainable mobility and delivering commercial solutions for fleets. So if you take a look at, okay, what are the different use cases here? So the fleet conversion, it's about, a big part of it is taking risk out, right? That's something we can all feel as you have this conversation, and I feel it with the customers I work with. There's definitely an underlying current of there's risk, there's uncertainty. So go get me a fact base. What have others seen in that transition from ICE to EV? So this was about building that business case for conversion based on total cost of ownership, which I've been trying to answer some of that in the chat in the background here, and doing some comparisons, and also taking into account some of those big capital costs, particularly around the vehicle. So the knowledge, the intellectual property, the data that we've gained from Optimized Prime, we can use that for other large-scale EV projects. And I want to talk about, there's 3 outcomes that I think are interesting for today. The first learning was, hey, it's really good to do your fleet optimization before you try to electrify. And the reason is it's going to minimize the new infrastructure requirements. So you get a better sense for how many buses, how much electricity, what are they going to charge? You need a good plan for that instead of, I don't know, just replace them all and then we'll figure it out. The second is that power optimization and sourcing from renewables and the low carbon sources. That's really where you see the benefit of the drive towards the net zero outcomes. So if environmental concerns are a big driver for your change, you definitely got to look at the renewables. And then the last is the provision of the infrastructure funding that's coming. And the emergence of players that are willing to finance, take some of that cost off your balance sheet, change it from a CapEx to an OpEx. That's actually removed the barrier for a lot of fleets who say, I'd love to drive that vehicle, but it costs 3x of what I'm trying to replace. And that's just not something I can bite off right now. Well, the market finally is, they've now seen enough of them out there. We're starting to get a sense for not just the vehicle useful life, but the battery useful life. And so you recognize, oh, it's a slightly different financial calculation for the underwriter, but we're now seeing more and more people come in willing to take that risk because we've got data. Sorry, that's a theme I keep coming back to.
No, Justin, that's awesome. And I say we've got a lot of questions coming from the audience, which we will try and get to as many as we can. But Kyle, I know you're also, I've got a couple of projects or a project particularly you can talk to. Is that right?
Yep, absolutely. So, and it's interesting, Justin teed off with the battery, and the battery actually, in some ways, can start to be considered as a different asset than the vehicle. I don't know if there will be battery swapping. Potentially there will be at some point in time, but the battery can be financed and has a secondary life even after being consumed in a bus, or an electric vehicle. Maybe it's not as good of an asset for an electric vehicle. It's lost a little bit of its range, but there absolutely will be a secondary and potentially even a tertiary market for these batteries, a recycling market. And so Hitachi has worked and is working with First Bus out of Glasgow, Scotland, on an electric battery as a service program, where in this particular program, the First Bus actually acquired the buses as a complete unit. So think of that initial capital expenditure. Hitachi bought them back and it's leasing it back as an asset or as a service, excuse me. So again, thinking about that total cost of ownership and, oh, maybe that vehicle is a lot more than expensive than I'm used to. There's ways that we're looking at making sure that we can shift some of that from a capital intensive model back into maybe an operational model, because that's how your budget works. That's how your financing works, different components like that. So as we're converting to EV, it's really an opportunity for us to be innovative in the way that we're financing these vehicles.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kyle. Some great information. I want to bring this back to the three of you now. We've put a lot of ground, some great examples, but I guess for each of you, what would be the biggest outcomes and learnings from these projects that you could relay to our audience today? Dean, I don't know if you want to go first here.
Sure, I'll go first. And I always come back to know your customer. One is to understand what your system is, what you're trying to accomplish, and where you are today. So do your planning, do your homework, which means get the details. Understand what your limitations are. What are your pain points? Where do you want to go? What is the impact as we return to work from COVID? I mean, there's significant changes that I see from people wanting to be safe, wanting to be informed, and have that digitization. So that's the first part. Second is don't be afraid to do a pilot. Don't be afraid to engage with somebody to help you with that assessment phase, and then get into a small pilot. It's not committing to converting my entire fleet to EVs right now. It's doing a pilot. The next one would be to partner. You don't have to go it alone, and not every company can provide everything. We've talked about some of the great things Hitachi can do, and I'm really proud of what we're doing. But we partner with several great companies to impact and bring you success in your journey along EV. So I think a public-private partnership is a great way to go. I think public companies or private companies teaming up together to provide solutions is a great way. And the last one, and I'm going to hit it hard, is taking no action is not a good plan. saying, I'm going to think about it next year. We did that for a long time in electrification. Thinking about it next year is probably not going to get you there. There's a lot of push from the government, from the passengers, from municipalities, and from funding to take action to start planning now. So those are the big takeaways that I see as I've seen this EV journey. It's just super exciting to work with individuals like Kyle and Justin and my team and on such a great subject.
Super. Thank you, Dean. Justin, having listened to the last 50 minutes, I've got an inkling what your most important piece might be. But let's see if you can prove it right.
Yeah. For me, I always come back to the data, but recognize it has context. It starts, as Kyle talked about at the beginning, as you're putting together what are our goals, and particularly in a public transit context, you're going to have a lot of stakeholders, and so you're going to have a diverse set of goals, and that means we've got to measure sometimes competing objectives, and that's okay. It's just important to have that conversation, because it's an important part of your community adopting this new technology, not being afraid, but actually embracing it, understanding what you're trying to do for them, and then go get the data. What is it today? What would we like it to be? What's our path to get there? And then measure. And it doesn't have to be every single day, right? But you can think about quarterly, annually, just like you're used to doing your normal operational reporting and reading out to the board or county commissioners or different stakeholders. How are we doing? And show them progress so that it's not don't cause anxiety, right? It's more about getting a solid fact base and showing progress towards those goals.
Super, thank you, Justin. There was a comment on the chat about how they can actually contact the three of you. So I've just put up the slide with your information. We will have some questions as well, but Kyle, as well, I want you to put your biggest outcome and what you'd like to share.
Yeah, and it might sound simplistic, but it is. EVs and hydrogen vehicles are not ICE vehicles, and you need to consider that in your planning, your execution, and your optimization. But really, it's an opportunity for you to be innovative and to say, hey, what was I getting wrong with my ICE vehicles, and what can I potentially correct in my EVs? How can I change the system so that it's in my favor? And I think, again, that goes back to what Dean has said, where it's planning and working with partners, going out and finding the best in breed and working with them to make that plan or to execute that plan, and to be as best as you can be. And then finally, to hit it home, it's Justin's data. Data is very critical in this process, because if you don't know where you're coming from, you can't really explain where you've gone. And I think that's pretty important.
Well, I have to give you kudos. You really worked in. EVs are not your grandmother's vehicle. Wow, that's cool. I like that. You worked it in.
I didn't know your grandmother drove a bus.
What I'd like to do now, there's a series of questions that have come through, ranging across all sorts of topics. I'm going to kick off with one because Dean has referenced he'd like to answer this one. But also, chaps, as you see them, and I know you've been answering them as we go, but please, let's pick a few out and go for it. So, Dean, there was one from Joseph in the audience who asks, do you see battery swapping being reduced as shorter charging times are required? And then reference the Japanese taxis were doing battery swapping.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting technology. I think battery, first of all, in general, the technology behind producing batteries and the capacity of batteries, the energy density of batteries is changing on a monthly, if not daily basis, which is super exciting, because that goes back to that range fear. I don't know, how far can I drive before I run out of energy? The battery capacity is increasing, the density, energy density is increasing, the composite materials that are making it are being adjusted. So I think that is one of the key factors driving the adoption of EV vehicles, obviously, is how much energy can you store. Now, to battery swapping, I think there is one vertical that may see EV battery swapping pretty dang quickly, and that may be long-range trucking. Let's assume we get our trucks, and now they're EVs, and they're going across America. Normally, they would have to stop, swap out drivers, take a long rest, dress. Now it's an EV. So now you've got to charge this massive array of batteries. Well, how about if we could just swap out batteries, just like you would a normal gas station? You pull in, they pull out the rack of batteries, they push in a new rack of batteries after the driver's ready to go. If there is a driver, then the car gets back on the road. So I see long range trucking as battery swapping as one of the first nuts to crack as far as battery swapping.
Super, very good. Thank you, Dean. A question's just come in from Bill, which is, how can Hitachi help with the electrification process, assuming most are at the assessment phase, which I think they were when we did the poll earlier. I don't know who wants to take that one first.
Yeah, I'm happy to field that, because we've actually been getting questions from the utilities on the same thing, which is, hey, if this EV truck thing really takes off, we might have a problem. That it hints to one of the questions I answered in the chat as well. And if you think about it in the macro, if this takes 2 decades really to get through the adoption at the scale we're talking about, that's plenty of time to build out the grid. And in many places we have sufficient generation, healthy transmission lines. But as you start getting out to the ends, to the distributions and the feeders, and you start saying, yes, but what about in this neighborhood where historically I've had light commercial, and so it's really just lights and HVAC, and now all of a sudden I've got 30 trucks, 10 are in that yard, 15 over there, this guy's got 5, and you realize, oh yeah, I don't have that much capacity into that neighborhood today. So part of what we've been asked for is, what do we think the shape of that demand is going to look like? And it turns out it's quite regional and it's clustered. And that's, I think, where we'll feel in the short term, there's going to be a mismatch. And that's why having the plan in place so that you know about how many vehicles, about how fast, helps you then talk to your utility. Say, hey, I'm fixing to get 5, then 20, then 50, and I want to do it over this time period. And oh, it turns out your others in your neighborhood, right, that are off the same part of the grid as you, they've also got plans. And by allowing the utility to understand what's that collective demand going to look like, well, then they can go put together a good capital plan, get that approved, get it into the rate base, or help you understand, here's the financial implications of that on the infrastructure side, independent from the actual vehicle acquisition. And then you've actually got way better fact base for this decision. You understand the timelines, and now you can communicate clearly to your board, to your community, help people understand, okay, operationally, here's how this is going to come together over something measured in years.
I'm going to jump in here real quick. How do I start? I mean, this is how we can help, but how do I get started? Well, the first part is to reach out to us. And it's going to be a very discovery call. Just hi, this is who we are. This is what we can offer. And then we would do the listening part. That's where you can come to us and say, hey, this is where we are on that customer journey. This is what we are thinking about. We'll help you discover some of the pain points, but you may be very clear. This is my pain point. This is where I want to go. This is where I need funding. I need this type of analysis. So the first part of it is a discovery call with some of our experts to say, hey, how do we get started? And then we'll walk you down the journey if you need that first step, if you're not further along in the customer journey.
Super. So it's really, at this point, if you're in that assessment phase, I think, Dean, you said it early on, no region is quite the same. You guys are working with multiple and putting lots of this together. So there's data, there's case study, and actually asking the questions and seeing where you are and learning as you go. I think it's a really, really nice full circle, really, for people looking at that. There was one other question, Dean, that came through, which is it's on a slight tangent now, but they're not all on a theme, was around gas stations. Will these be converted to charging stations? And, what should we expect to see here?
That's a fantastic question. So you're talking about the ancillary impacts of transitioning to an EV, maybe not EV, but hydrogen, an alternative energy source for powering transportation systems, and maybe electric powered planes, if you think, electric powered trains, electric powered cars. What is the impact on maintenance stations? What's the impact on dealerships? Do they have charging stations? Are you going to direct order from Tesla? What is the impact on gas stations? How many gas stations have to be converted to EVs? These are all questions that don't have answers right now. And that's where Justin talked about over the 2 decades that we imagine this is going to take to transition. That will happen. The market dynamics will make that happen. But that's part of the consideration from experts in the field. And it's another branch, like you said, it's kind of tangent, but it's something to consider. I mean, you're redoing the transportation system writ large, and it's pretty exciting. And it doesn't have to be daunting. It's going to happen, but it's super exciting. And I think there was one comment also, what's going to happen to the firefighters? Do they have to be retrained on how to take care of EV vehicles? Well, yeah, there's lots of things to consider, and very important things to consider when you talk about a full-scale adoption of EVs.
Super, very good. I realize, folks, this has been one of the most sort of best laid out and clear sort of demonstrable sort of conversation on those next steps, but we are rapidly approaching time. So I wonder if, Dean, perhaps you're best placed to sort of just give a wrap of what we've covered very quickly, and also to look to potential next steps.
Sure. I just want to thank Justin and Kyle for your time and your expertise. I enjoy working with you. I think we have a great team. I also want to thank the audience for your time. I know 55 minutes is a long time to listen to, but we talk about this nonstop. This is what we do on a daily basis. It's what we concentrate on. We have fun figuring out answers to customers' problems, and how can we help get electrification and help the environment. So I think we've learned that from the poll and from talking to customers that everybody is different. Most people are in the assessment phase. It's early stage adoption, less than 5%, definitely less than 10%. So now is the time to start doing the planning. Now is the time to think about what's next. You don't necessarily have to write a check right now. You don't have to give a blank check to somebody to say, hey, electrify, but it's now the time to start figuring out what is my understanding? What is my transportation system? Where am I trying to go? And then take the next step to engage with your partners, private industries, your other maybe utilities, your surrounding public entities, and start having a plan, whether it's at the state, federal, or local level. Engage with your leaders to start coming up with an EV plan and an EV transition. The awareness for me, the number one for me is the awareness, and I know it goes back to data for Justin, but it's the awareness of what's going to happen and the awareness of how I can get there. So again, I just want to thank everybody for their time and their attention.
Super. Thank you, Dean. A couple of just quick comments from me to Justin, Kyle, and Dean. That was fantastic. Really, really helpful for me and for our audience. Lots of questions have come through, and I know the team here will be keen to try and answer those offline as well. Also questions around the slides from lots of folk. I'm sure the Hitachi team will be happy to share them to follow up with folk who want to learn more. And this will now be straight onto demand. So if you want to watch it again or review pieces or share with colleagues, then of course, please do so. In the meantime, a big thank you from us and from Reuters, and thank you for tuning in. Cheers.
Cheers.